Hey folks, tonight we're stepping into the grim, gritty, and far less glamorous world of medieval assassins. Those shadowy figures who slipped through castle corridors and alleyways, rewriting history with a whisper and a blade. Sure, Hollywood paints them as stylish rogues in flowing cloaks. But the truth? Being a medieval assassin was absolutely miserable. Before you get comfy, hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of deep dive. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. It is always wild to see how far our time-traveling squad reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that immersive background hum. And let's slide quietly into tonight's story. Let's set something straight. No one in the Middle Ages woke up thinking, you know what I want to do today? Stab a noble in the throat for a handful of coins and spend 3 days hiding in a barrel. Becoming an assassin wasn't a dream. It was a last resort when life had chewed you up and spit you out in a ditch. Most assassins weren't elite warriors trained in ancient mountain temples. They were desperate ex-soldiers, disgraced peasants, washed-up thieves, basically anyone who had nothing left to lose and was good at not being seen. If you had wealth or land or even a semi-functioning goat, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. The people who took these jobs, they were ghosts in the system. Ex-cons, wanderers, outcasts. And when someone needed a problem solved, all it took was a coin purse slid across a table and a whispered name. And no, that name was never Bob the Quiet Beekeeper. It was someone dangerous, a corrupt baron, a bishop with too many enemies, a guy with 12 guards and a moat full of things that bite. The pay, tempting. The job, nightmare fuel. But for these people, there was no other choice. No family, no future. Definitely no dental plan. Let's not forget the zero benefits. No retirement, no glory, no sick days. You couldn't exactly open a business card that read, "Quiet eliminations, discreet and affordable." You just stayed quiet, moved fast, and never told anyone what you did. Especially not after 3 ales in a tavern. Oh yeah, I'm a traveling, rug salesman. These stains die, totally die. Nobody wanted to be an assassin. They ended up there because the world shoved them into the shadows, handed them a rusty blade, and wished them luck. You weren't the hero. You weren't even the villain. You were a footnote, one that made everyone nervous, and odds are you didn't live long enough to enjoy your earnings. Poison, the so-called elegant weapon of assassins. A quiet kill. No screaming, no steel on bone. Just a sip, a sigh, and silence. That was the fantasy. Reality? It was like trying to win a bar fight with herbal tea and passive aggression. First problem, poison in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly reliable. There was no neat little vial labeled instant doom. You had plants, fungi, maybe some suspicious lizard powder, and a whole lot of guesswork. You didn't measure doses. You guessed. Too little? The noble vomits and skips dinner. Too much? You drop dead before dessert. Kitchens were chaos. You couldn't just sneak in and season the stew with nightshade. You had to bribe a cook, sneak past guards, or, worst case, poison a dish that would pass through 3 human tasters and a royal food-sniffing dog. Yes, a dog. Nobles treated meals like battlefield maneuvers. Everything was sampled, blessed, and inspected. By the time it reached their plate, the food had more security clearance than most kings. Even if your poison slipped through, there were complications. Some toxins worked fast. Others took days. One moment your mark is laughing. The next, they're clutching their guts and demanding an exorcism. And if they lived, guess who gets blamed? Not the cook, not the taster. You, the quiet weirdo who knows too much about mushrooms. If you were caught, it wasn't quick. You were interrogated with tools that had names like the tongue splitter and the knee whimperer. And they didn't stop until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the Duke to his favorite hunting falcon. And let's say you did succeed. Maybe you toppled a tyrant, sabotaged a royal bloodline, shifted the fate of a kingdom. You'd think your name would be remembered, right? Wrong. You were never meant to be remembered. Best case scenario, you became a rumor, a hooded shadow, a name whispered behind closed doors. Some claimed you vanished into the night. Others thought you never existed at all. That was the goal. Your client didn't want your story. They wanted deniability. The fewer who knew your name, the safer they were, and the less likely they'd need to poison you next. So your name disappeared the moment the blade was cleaned. You didn't brag. You didn't take trophies. You didn't even exist outside the job. If someone did know who you were, that was a problem. And in your line of work, problems had very short lifespans. There were no medals for silence, no statues for the man who stopped a war with one well-placed blade. If a noble wanted a monument, they commissioned one. You got a box, if you were lucky. If not, you got a spike and a sign that said traitor. Sometimes your name was remembered just long enough to be cursed. You became a warning. Dante, anger the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich? And the man who did it? Gone, like smoke. That was your legacy. Not fame, not fear. Let's say you beat the odds. You survived the job. The knife struck clean, no screams, no guards. Just a body hitting the floor and a mission accomplished. Now comes the easy part, right? Wrong. Being a successful assassin in medieval times didn't earn you a rooftop toast while cities burned in the background. It meant sprinting through alleys with someone else, blood on your boots, and a dog already tracking your scent. There was no celebration, no pint with friends, no post-job cool-down. Your reward was a week of paranoia, blisters, and sleepless nights in haylofts that smelled like goat and regret. You didn't get a receipt. You didn't meet your client for a handshake and thank you scroll. They disappeared the second your work was done, because now you were the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. Where the victim was, how you got in, who paid for it. When you walked away with a few blood-stained coins, you also walked away with a giant invisible target on your back. And so began the second act of the assassin's life. Get out. You needed exit routes, disguises, bribed boatmen, maybe a monastery in the hills where monks didn't ask questions and pretended not to notice your twitch every time someone dropped a spoon. Because the moment the kill happened, the city changed. Lockdowns, checkpoints, angry guards shouting your vague description and waving around a sketch that looked more like a sad potato than a person, but close enough to get you hanged. You changed your name, again, became Brother Lucian, humble, silent, and definitely not covered in royal blood. You shaved your beard, slouched a little more, learned a fake limp. It was exhausting. It was constant. And it was the price of success. You had one rule: trust no one, especially the client. Clients didn't hire assassins because they admired their work. They hired them because they wanted something terrible done, and then wanted that terrible thing to vanish. Sometimes that meant you vanishing too. Some clients ghosted you completely. Others, they hired a second assassin to clean up the first. Double booking medieval edition, you got no refund, no warning. Just a dagger in your spine courtesy of someone with the same job title. And if you were foolish enough to threaten them, to say, "Pay me or I talk," that was your last sentence. Nobody negotiated with assassins. They silenced them. Best case scenario, you got paid and left alone. But even then, you spent every night assuming someone was watching you, that a steel blade had your name on it, carved in silence by someone just like you. Because in this business, if you killed once, you could kill again. Let's say somehow you beat the odds. You survived the jobs, the lies, the poisons, the betrayals. You outlasted your enemies, your employers, and maybe even your own morality. Now what? Retirement? Not a chance. In the medieval world, assassins didn't retire, they vanished, or they died. Often both. There was no cottage by the sea, no pension, no peace. You didn't get a gold coin and a warm handshake, you just disappeared. Even if you walked away, the job didn't walk away from you. You had too many names in your head, too many secrets behind your eyes, too many ghosts in your bed. People didn't want you retired, they wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried. And if no one came for you, and that's a big if, you still lived every day waiting for the blade that didn't warn you. You changed your name. Again. Moved to a village no one could pronounce. Sold herbs, pretended to be an ex-guard, told stories about your limp. You avoided town squares. You sat with your back to the wall. You kept your knife under the floorboards next to a bag of coins you never spent because they still smelled like someone else's blood. And worst of all, you didn't even trust yourself anymore. Years of silent killings and frantic escapes rewired your brain. Every knock at the door made you freeze. Every cough in the street was a warning. You didn't dream. Dreams were dangerous. You didn't love. Love asked questions. You didn't laugh too loud. Laughter drew attention. You lived like a ghost, trying to pretend to be human. And in the end, there was no end. Just the slow fade into obscurity. Always moving. Always watching. Until one day you slipped into the dark, and no one noticed. And that meant nobody, not even your client, wanted to be next. If siege tunnels were the silent killers of ancient warfare, then counter-tunnels were the frantic CPR attempts to keep the city breathing. As soon as defenders suspected digging, maybe the ground started vibrating, or someone heard muffled grunting beneath the wine cellar, they sprang into action. They dig their own tunnels, sometimes at wild angles, just to intersect the enemies. What followed was not strategic elegance, it was chaos. Imagine two teams of filthy, desperate men meeting underground in total darkness, swinging pickaxes, daggers, or whatever they had on hand, all while trying not to choke on dust or pass out from lack of air. No banners, no speeches, just sweaty panic and the hope you stabbed the right silhouette. Some of these battles ended in collapse, others in mass suffocation. And if things got really creative, defenders would flood the tunnels, set smoke traps, or release bees. Yes, bees. Because nothing says defending civilization like unleashing winged chaos in a mine shaft. Still, tunneling was cheap, relatively quiet, and terrifyingly effective. You didn't need 1,000 soldiers or a 10-ton war engine, just patience, shovels, and the willingness to bury your enemy without a sound. But even when it worked, it wasn't pretty. Walls didn't crumble like in the movies. They cracked, groaned, and then exploded into panic, often taking nearby defenders with them. And once that breach opened up, cue the screaming. By now, you've probably noticed a theme in siege warfare. Nothing about it was clean. There were no neat victories or elegant conquests. It was mud, fire, disease, and the slow grind of morale being chewed up one rock at a time. And when all else failed, when the rams broke, the towers burned, the tunnels flooded, there was one final tool left in the invader's kit: time. Sieges weren't just battles. They were psychological sieves. You starved the city, choked its water, cut its trade, and waited. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months. Food ran out. Rats became meals. Disease blossomed. The air grew thick with rot and desperation. And inside those walls, the defenders weren't planning bold last stands. They were counting crumbs and praying the invaders got bored. But make no mistake, siege warfare was never fair. It didn't reward the brave or the bold. It rewarded the stubborn, the sadistic, and the ones with the biggest granary. Sometimes a city fell not because it was weak, but because it ran out of hope. Because the children cried louder than the generals yelled. Because no amount of courage can fill an empty stomach or heal plague-blistered skin. And when the gates finally opened, either from a battering ram or betrayal, it wasn't over. It was just the beginning of the real horror. No ancient army marched in to applause. They swarmed in like a flood, and what followed was looting, screaming, and fire. Always fire. Cities didn't just fall, they were gutted. Their people weren't spared because they fought bravely. They were punished for it. So the next time someone tells you medieval warfare was noble and glorious, remind them of the siege, of the tunnels, the trebuchets, the starvation, and the silence that followed. Remind them that conquest didn't just break walls, it broke people. And that in the end, the most powerful weapon in the ancient world wasn't steel or stone. It was patience sharpened into cruelty. But let's not pretend the defenders were saints. They had tricks of their own, and some of them were straight out of a nightmare. Hot oil? Sure, but that was expensive. Boiling water? More common. Burning sand dumped through murder holes? Surprisingly effective. It slipped past armor, clung to skin, and turned your average invader into a screaming meat puppet in seconds. And then there were the beehives. Yes, actual beehives launched from walls or catapulted with a prayer and a buzz. If you've never seen a man in chainmail flee from airborne insects like he is being chased by ghosts, well, congratulations. You haven't lived through medieval combat. Defenders also mastered the fine art of psychological warfare. Sometimes they'd toss dead bodies over the walls, not enemy corpses but their own. Diseased, bloated, and clearly beyond help. A message to the attackers. Yes, we're dying in here. Want to catch what we've got? It didn't stop there. Some cities painted their walls with blood, displayed heads like trophies, or set up dummies dressed in armor to fake larger numbers. Others rang bells at random intervals, played war drums through the night, or shouted out false reports. Reinforcements are coming. Hope you brought snacks. But all of that, all the boiling liquids and buzzing chaos, only delayed the inevitable. Because if your enemies were determined enough, if they had the time and the supplies and zero moral restraint, they would get in. Always. And when they did, the punishment was biblical. Towns that resisted too hard were made examples. The streets ran red. Anyone who had picked up a sword or looked like they might one day consider it was butchered. Buildings were burned, treasures looted, and survivors, if they were lucky, were sold as slaves. If they weren't lucky, well, let's just say their stories didn't end with a happily ever after. This wasn't cruelty for fun. It was strategy. The next city would think twice. Word spread fast. Resistance became hesitation. And hesitation? That's how you win wars without lifting another siege engine. So what have we learned from all this delightful history of destruction? That ancient and medieval warfare was less about grand charges and noble duels and more about engineering misery. You didn't need the biggest sword. You needed the best carpenters. Siege warfare was about who could build the most terrifying wooden contraption, dig the sneakiest tunnel, or wait the longest without coughing up a lung. The real victors weren't heroes in shining armor. They were the ones who could count supplies, manage plague outbreaks, and still sleep through the sound of their own men screaming in the night. And if you think all this horror ended when the walls finally fell, think again. Because sometimes the siege didn't end at all. It just changed shape. After the breach, after the screaming and the smoke, came the occupation. And let me tell you, no one throws a welcome parade for the army that just starved their children. What followed was control, paranoia, and the kind of peace that grinds your soul instead of comforting it. The conquerors weren't exactly gentle administrators. They tore down local temples, replaced city leaders with their own lapdogs, and restructured the economy, usually by taking anything shiny and reminding you that bread now cost 3 times more than it used to. And don't even think about revolting. That just brought a second wave of punishments. Spoiler, they were worse. Sometimes a city would try to rebuild, patch the walls, bury the dead, pretend everything was normal. But memory has a way of lingering in stone. Kids grew up playing near the crater where the tower used to be. Elders whispered about the night the sky turned red. And the market square? Yeah, it still smelled faintly like burning flesh no matter how many flowers were planted. Sieges left scars on people, on places, on entire civilizations. They reshaped maps, toppled dynasties, and rewrote the rules of power. The message was simple and brutal. If you can't defend your walls, you don't deserve to keep what's inside them. But perhaps the most terrifying thing about siege warfare wasn't on the weapons or the fire or the disease. It was the patience, the cold, calculating certainty that if you just waited long enough, the human spirit would crack. That courage would run out. That hunger would win. Because in the end, sieges weren't about glory. They were about breaking people slowly. And the worst part? It worked. There's a strange kind of silence that follows a siege. Not peace. Peace is earned. This is something else. A hollow, echoing quiet, where once there was fire and screaming and death. It creeps through broken halls, nestles in collapsed roofs, hums faintly in empty wells. A silence that doesn't heal. It haunts. The survivors? If they're lucky, they live long enough to wonder whether survival was worth it. They sift through rubble looking for bread crusts and brothers. They speak in whispers, flinch at shadows, and dream in screams. Because after a siege, the world doesn't snap back into place. It stays bent. Empires rise from these ashes. Banners are hoisted. Monuments are built. Victors call it destiny. Losers call it ruin. Historians call it turning points. But none of them smell the rot. None of them remember the child who coughed herself to death because the grain store was poisoned. We glorify the generals. We name buildings after kings. But the ones who actually broke the gates? They don't get statues. They get forgotten, buried in shallow graves outside the walls they helped destroy. Siege warfare didn't make heroes. It made rubble. And stories no one wanted to tell out loud. Because the truth is, there's nothing noble about starving people into silence. Nothing grand about launching fire into cradles or digging tunnels beneath sacred ground. This wasn't chess. It was a meat grinder dressed up in strategy. And everyone, defenders, attackers, civilians, animals, everyone got chewed up. So next time someone talks about the glory of conquest, ask them how much glory fits inside a burnt-out granary, or how it smells when 10,000 people breathe their last in the same week. Ask them what honor tastes like after 3 months of boiled leather boots.